You met Bridget yesterday, but Bridget's a chartered engineer and researcher with 17 years experience in transport policy, design, communicating, community engagement and participatory planning. She's a recognised leading thinker in inclusiveness and human-centred planning in transport in New Zealand. She works on local community projects through to national and international research to challenge and improve best practice. I also like to say that just following her LinkedIn profile, which has been a little bit quiet for a while, makes you a better person, and will provide lots of interesting feeds. I've got another couple. Oh, she's a Venn diagram master. Hand her a wicked problem, and don't be surprised if she hands it back to you with 3 neat little circles and it all sorted out for action. She's a Master of Engineering and Transportation, a Doctor of Philosophy. She's a charter member of Engineering New Zealand, principal researcher at MR Cagney, and a past chair of the Transportation Group in New Zealand. And she is silly and serious. Is it silly and serious, or silly and
mostly silly but professional? Yeah, I think those two can coexist. Yes, I think part of the key to life is seeing the ridiculous in the everyday and not taking ourselves too seriously. Even though we're talking about important topics, it doesn't mean we can't laugh and keep our perspective all the time. Thank you very much, Prue. It's great to have everybody here. I have 2 props to show you as part of introducing myself. One is my snacks. When you do these webinars, you get very good at knowing the quantity and nature of snacks that are going to get you through. And I've got nuts, but also in the mix, Reese's peanut butter chips, which are amazing, and especially in a little snack thing when you're in a lot of online meetings, I recommend those. And the other thing is my favorite book. Oh, you can't even see it. It's called The School of Life by Elaine de Botton, and it's about humans and how we engage with each other, relationships, understanding ourselves, self-awareness, and silliness. It's been really formational for me, actually, as an adult human, and it helps to understand some of the things that humans do when they're crossing streets, for example, or choosing what mode to use. And it helps also with compassion for understanding when other people don't have the same perspective as us. So The School of Life, recommended. Now, today, can you see my screen all working well, Prue?
Perfect.
Yep, good. Today we're going to talk about the who of race crossings, who uses them, and how we understand them better. So there's 4 main topics we're going to talk about. We're going to have some more Miro exercises, opportunities to comment in the chat on things, and we're going to cover these. Why inclusion is important, transport psychology, so how people using streets make decisions and what we know about that and how we can use that when we're choosing where and how to design these things. Principles of Inclusive Transport, SOS, and if you come out of this whole webinar series knowing nothing else, you will know what SOS stands for. And then disability sector engagement, why that's important and how to do it. I added this slide after a couple of series because I've had some feedback from people about language, and it's important to get it right. And I talk a lot about disabled people in this slide set, and I am used to saying disabled people because that is the way that we describe disabled people in New Zealand. That term came about through engagement with disability groups and communities by government at a broad level, not even within transport, but a whole of government approach to inclusion. In Australia, it's much more common to say people with disabilities, and so both are fine in terms of what you're writing in your work and commenting in this course, but that's where they come from, and there's some links there to understand that if you're wondering yourself or having conversations with colleagues about how to write things in your work.
Just very quickly, Bridget, can I just interrupt and say from my experience, like watching this webinar, it's made me realise that this isn't something that's static, that you need to keep revisiting it and keep checking that the language you're using is correct, because it does change.
Yep, yeah, it does change, and it also changes depending on a local context, and it's the same when we're working with any kind of community group. It's best to talk with them about how they'd like to be referred to in writing and in public and speaking and things. So while that language rules might hold for a country as a whole, if you're working in a specific community, ask them if you're not sure how to refer to them. So here's a few stories to start off with. The first one is about Martha, and Martha was travelling to work and she got the train and she had to change trains at a station in Auckland City in New Zealand. And so she was sitting on the platform waiting for the train, and then suddenly everybody around her seemed to stop and pause and then stand up, and then they left the platform. And Martha was a bit confused about that, but didn't know any differently, so stayed there. And then she saw on another platform her train leaving from a different platform, and there had been an announcement about that, but Martha is deaf, so she didn't hear the announcement, and there was no other way that she would have known that her train was, the platform had changed at short notice. The next story is about Lara and Kelly. These are all true stories from people I've talked to. Lara and Kelly are friends. They both use wheelchairs, and it can be quite a challenge when you use a wheelchair and have a friend who uses a wheelchair, which is not an uncommon thing if you use a wheelchair, because you might find that the systems that might work for one person with a wheelchair don't work for more than one. And Lara and Kelly they planned to go to a concert a couple of kilometers from where they lived. One of them lived, and so they were going to get the bus, and they waited for the bus, and the first driver was full and they didn't stop. The second driver said they already had a pram on board and couldn't fit two wheelchairs, so they couldn't get on that one. And then the next bus, the ramp was broken or something, and they couldn't get on that bus either. So all of these systems that are set up to enable accessible and inclusive transport, they don't always work, and there aren't always good, affordable backup choices for people. So Lara and Kelly wheeled themselves a couple of kilometres along the hilly streets of Auckland to get to the concert, only to find that the venue had steps to get in and they couldn't get there. Even though it was advertised as having an accessible bathroom, that bathroom was inside the building, which had steps. So all of the components of the system aren't necessarily enough to enable a journey. They all have to work together so that people can get out and about and live their lives. So they just went home again, and all they got from their day was a tiring outing on the streets. This one's about Duncan. He lives in Auckland as well, and he walks down to the local shops every now and then, and the council had done some work on the intersections, and they had installed the tactile paving incorrectly. Womp womp. It happens all the time. It's really common with tactile paving to not be installed correctly, and in this case the tactile pavers were staggered. And it's done so that they're closer to the curb or to the road edge than they would otherwise be. But almost always it's not necessary to do that. It's much better to have a straight, flat line of tactiles. The reason for that is that blind people use the alignment of those tactiles to know where the crossing is, what direction to go. And so because they were staggered, Duncan was at 90 degrees to where he was supposed to be going, and he would have headed straight out into the middle of the intersection, not towards the other side, if his partner who was there said, hang on, you're pointing the wrong way. So this stuff
we're still on Martha.
Oh, well, there's Lara and Kelly, and there's Duncan. I'm on two screens,
There's
and that's
Duncan.
why. Yeah, so there's Duncan. So okay. All of this stuff is important because there is a time and effort cost to being a disabled person or to having difficulties in your life that mean you can't use the infrastructure that other people can use, or you don't have these backup plans or resiliency. And it's really easy, which goes back to my School of Life book really. They talk in there about humans always have to guess what another person's perspective is from their head, right? And it leads to a lot of misunderstandings in relationships when we assume that somebody feels and thinks a certain way about a situation and their experience is actually different. And so there's 7 billion different perspectives on the world, from the heads of different humans. And when you're a disabled person, by definition, the environment doesn't work for you like it does for other people. That's what disability means. It means the environment disables you. So these situations and transport infrastructure becomes really essential whether people can actually live their daily life or not, because they don't necessarily have options to just walk a different way, to get a different form of transport. And so we have quotes like this come up in surveys all the time, that the alternative just seemed like a nightmare. So the upshot of that is that people won't make the trip. Tactile pavings, as I say, I'm actually getting to the point in my career where I'm questioning their value, which sounds really dramatic, but they're installed incorrectly so often. I wonder whether it would be better to take all of that money and just put it into more raised crossings than to put wrong tactiles everywhere. We don't seem to go and audit them very effectively and force their good construction. This one in the picture was from Hamilton, and it's a crossing to nowhere. So this was installed before the footpath was built on the other side. I'm not even sure there is a footpath on the other side several years later. So a lot of blind people will say they don't trust the tactiles anyway, because a lot of the time they're not going anywhere, or they're not going in the correct direction. So it's important that all of us as professionals understand what we're designing and that we take accountability for that right through to construction, because there's lots of places where our best intentions can fall down. Inclusion is also important because of policy, and we heard from Hafez last time about safe system policy and Vision Zero, and how we are all really well versed in understanding that the goal is to have reduced, or zero ideally, death and trauma from people just getting about and living their lives. When it comes to inclusion, we all have policies in our countries and states and regions around making inclusive and equitable environments. Equity is a word that's coming up quite a lot recently as well. And we have anti-discrimination and human rights legislation. So it's important that we consider all this stuff. New Zealand government policy statement says, or used to say, it's kind of in flux at the moment, being redrafted, but we need to have transport choices so all people can easily access everything that they need to live a good life. At the moment, research suggests that all people cannot easily access those things. So it's important that we consider that.
Bridget, just a quick question. You mentioned before about the tactiles, and just bringing that back to the Australian standards. My understanding was that the Australian standards are the best attempt we can make to comply with the Disability Discrimination Act. But really the heart and the core of the Disability Discrimination Act is about engaging with people to meet their needs. So is that how you understand that it works?
I think it's stronger. It's tied to legislation more strongly in Australia than in New Zealand, where I work. We don't have very strong precedents for disability discrimination legislation being enforced. So we don't talk about it in that way, really. But I would agree with you that really the spirit of the law, and I get into this a bit later, talking about and how we measure inclusion, would say that we want people to be able to get where they need to go. That's the goal. And to do that with dignity and in a way that's comfortable for them. Tactiles are means to an end, but they do tend to get sidetracked by zealous or just eager and keen transport professionals who want to do the right thing. And so we have a lot of them in a lot of places. And then, as I say, they don't necessarily get constructed correctly, and they're missing. A lot of our streets were built before the tactile pavers were a thing, so it's inconsistent from the outset. So I think the message for the audience here is to do your best to design tactiles correctly. We have to put them in at the moment. But just remember that contractors aren't necessarily going to follow what you've designed. So be as clear and as explicit as possible about the council or the local authority needing to enforce that design in particular. So when we talk about inclusion, it's not, even though I talk about disability a lot, it's not like we're designing for disabled people and other people. We're designing for everybody, and all of us have a different kinds of capabilities day to day and throughout our lives. If you look at this picture, it talks about sight, hearing, dexterity, strength. If you think about yourself as a 9-month-old child, you had different kinds of capabilities then, right, than you do now, hopefully, unless you're amazing. And that is totally normal when we all started off like that, particularly the dexterity one. And there are people around, adults who have weak strength in their hands for some reason, or in their arms or in their upper body, which means they can't necessarily open a jar or open a heavy door, or even press a button in a bus to alert it to stop. There's all sorts of variation among humans. So if you think about, could a baby do this? Could a toddler do this? Could a 7-year-old do this? Could someone who's 98 do this? Then you start to understand the kind of variety of humans that we're talking about. And then on top of all of that, we have emotions and feelings and how we're going, how much energy we have in our days. And so this picture is about mental health and well-being. So we might be feeling pain. You know, most women of childbearing age are in pain for a day or two a month, and that varies a lot in the population. A lot of people just live with chronic pain for different reasons, particularly when they're out and about and active using the streets that we're all designing. We all have different levels of wellness, energy, anxiety, especially become more apparent since lockdowns and COVID. We're talking about that more, which doesn't mean that it's lessened. It's just out there and something that we need to consider. You might not think, well, I'm a transport engineer, who cares about human anxiety and depression? But the easier that we can make transport environments for people to navigate, then the lesser disabled they are by that environment. So if we make it easy for people to cross the street, it's just one less thing they have to worry about in their day. So having said that, we are going to jump into Miro. So could you put the link back in the chat for us, Prue?
Oh, yes.
Or I've got it if you like. You got it?
Hang on. Just a minute. Maybe you.
I've got it.
I've got it here.
Oh, it's a race.
That's another one to music. Oh no,
oh.
got in there.
So if you can all find module 2, the Who of Raised Crossings, it's got a big yellow banner, and we've got Miro exercise 1, and it says, how are you feeling today? So I would like you to please grab a sticky note or an emoji or sticker if you prefer. I think I will get a sticker with a picture on it and put yourself on this graph. I like explaining things in graphs because I'm an engineer and I like mathematics. And so this is a axis of how you're feeling mentally, how well you feel, how alert and happy, and how you're feeling physically. Are you feeling on top of your game? If you've digested your breakfast, you're feeling all good and hydrated, put yourself somewhere from poor to great in your alertness and mental well-being, and from poor to great in your physical health flexibility I've put in fitness. And you might want to think, well, better than I was yesterday, not as good as I was 10 years ago. It's all relative, right? And completely subjective. There's no right or wrong answers here, that's for sure. It's just to understand that everybody is different and we all bring different versions of ourselves along to our workplaces and to our day. Glad some of you have found stickers and putting some comments on where you are. So if you've put your item on the left side of the screen, that means you're not feeling great physically. So feel free to drag that if you think that that's not true. It might be true, and that's fine as well. And also, for some of us, not feeling great is still not bad, right? This is all compared to our own baseline of how we think our energy waxes and wanes. Cool. Just as I
all
hoped.
Have days like that. I like that face
absolutely.
Face emoji.
Yeah, the not sure one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Face palm. Yeah, absolutely we do. And it changes through the day, right? Awesome. We're going back into Miro shortly, so I'll jump back to the slides for now. Feel free to stay there or just keep listening. There's another factor in all of these things that affects participation, which is really the point of transport. I'm quite often saying this, that it's interesting to me that we measure mobility and traffic volumes and we model them and we count cars and measure delays at intersections and things, but we don't often measure the outcome that we want from this investment, which is, are people doing stuff? Are they getting where they need to go and living their lives? I think that's because that's not really a civil engineering question, where the transport engineering sector kind of came from. The civil engineering community is not so concerned with well-being and participation, but should be, because that's the purpose of all of this investment, particularly in transport. And the point of this slide is that those things are affected by income, and the people who design the transport system, which is us, are not usually in the lowest income bracket in society, because we're working in usually relatively well paid jobs. So
Bridget, can I
Yep.
Just another interest. Just wondering if this is something we really have to consider a lot more carefully when we're thinking about people walking and cycling, because if we are driving cars, the difference between our physical and mental capabilities are not going to have such an impact, and many people can't drive cars. But when we're talking about active transport, the diversity just is huge, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that we put the most effort in transport into the mode that's actually the most simple to design for, because we've got this universal vehicle running around streets. They all have pretty much 4 wheels. Even there's not much difference between a tractor and a Mini in terms of how you design the roads and streets. They all do the same thing and go the same ways, and Google tells them where they can and can't go. But if you're a pedestrian, Google doesn't necessarily know where you want to go. Like, how often have we looked up pedestrian walking directions on Google Maps and thought to ourselves, actually, I'll cut through that way, or I'll go this way, or that's hilly, I don't want to go that way. And that's for me as a non-disabled person thinking that. But if you are blind or you're feeling sick, for example, Google Maps isn't necessarily going to help you in terms of what you need. So designing for walking is the most complex, I think.
And our design guidance, even for vehicles, we take the hardest vehicle and we design for that. We make sure that local street can carry the rubbish truck and it will be perfectly accommodated, but we don't necessarily do the same when we're looking at our
definitely. I've talked about using a blind person. I have 3 kind of design humors. I don't think I mention it in these slides, but my go-to at the moment is a blind adult, a person using a manual wheelchair, and an 8-year-old child. If we designed all our walking environments for those 3 people, then they'd pretty much work for everybody who's going to make the effort to go out the front door in the first place, I think. And we'll come back to why that's the case a bit later on. So as I said, straight back into Miro. Actually, I've changed this question, I think.
Right.
Yeah, I have. I might just change it live.
Okay, I'll bring everyone to us.
Raised crossings part of a just climate transition? So when we talk about income, the reason I changed this is to keep it up to date with current policy and practice in transport. And I am seeing a lot more work going into emissions reduction and active transport as part of that. So a lot of you will get involved in raised crossings as part of some kind of government intervention into streets for people, or transformational works, or retrofitting for active modes. And a lot of the time at the moment, that's justified as part of climate change stuff. So what do you think? Are raised crossings part of a just climate transition? And I've done an example here where I've put a little tree sticker. So choose a sticker or emoji that is your answer to that question, or what it makes you think about, or just the first sticker you find. I really don't mind. And then the main point is to put a post-it note next to it to explain what you think. Are raised crossings part of a just climate transition? A just transition means that the way we adapt to climate change is going to benefit and disadvantage different groups for different reasons. So there's a lot of talk about that at the moment, a just transition. What do you think raised crossings have got to do with that? And if you're not sure, feel free to write that. I don't know. I've never thought about it. It might be something that has never crossed your mind.
There's got to be an emoji for
that. Definitely. Definitely. This is also just little Miro practice, trying to find the stickers. They are in that little, there's a plus button in the legend where it says more apps. You click on that. Oh no, my one already had stickers and emojis up, so I think it had already found them. The stickers and emojis should be either there or already on your menu, and there are a lot. Or maybe there's a polar bear, RIP. I'll find another animal because this is so fun.
Well, that's a good emoji anyway. I like the confused witches hats. I think there's a lot of confused witches hats in the world.
That's awesome. I had some visitors from Australia here last week, and I was driving them to my friend's wedding, and they said, there's so many road cones in New Zealand. They're different to Australian ones. And I was like, what's the difference? And they said, our ones are girthier. Apparently our road cones are slimmer than Australian road cones, whatever that means.
Right.
Yeah, I think that one looks like an Australian road cone to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are some people saying, Prue?
Yep. Oh, we've got some great comments here. Yes, as they make walking an easier and safer choice, whilst also making driving less attractive. Yes, race crossings help us prioritize sustainable transport for people with the fewest choices. I like this little emoji that's just got a parent with 2 children. We can see that we're thinking of different road users there. Prioritize local transportation to allow communities of all incomes to have better access. I think this is a great point. I notice a lot that we talk so much about how we don't have a lot of walking and cycling in Australia, and so many trips are under 2 kilometres or 5 kilometres and things, but I don't see a lot of effort going into actually making those short trips safe, and acknowledging that like everyday facilities like shops and bus stops are things that people, you know, may not feel safe accessing and things. So putting that work in to actually make those short trips safe so people can do them. Well, this is a detailed one. Let me have a look here. Yes, because a race crossing will be part of a larger framework to promote the greater motive shift towards walking access and public transport from private vehicle use and increasing safety. So I really like that that brings it back to, you know, these are a single treatment, but it's part of a broader strategy in terms of diversifying our network. And I guess that's one of the reasons behind the whole race crossing the course. It's like looking at a strategic level, doing these interventions again and again. These small interventions is something how we can change the system.
Totally.
And we've got whales, obviously they're important.
Yeah, that was me.
I
really like that someone has said they're not sure. I think it's part of a much bigger question. That's a really good point. And as it happens, I'm about to release a white paper about transport, climate, and equity. So stay tuned if you want to hear more about that. I'm pretty sure I mentioned race crossings more than once in that paper. But we've also had feedback from some disabled people who say, actually, race crossings are discriminatory because I have to drive and they make my pain worse when I drive over them. And I've worked with the disability groups on that, and the groups that I work with, I say that there's a logical fallacy in using isolated examples to counter something that actually does a lot of good for a lot of people. So it can be quite difficult if you come up against those kinds of arguments. But of course, as Ken will tell you in Module 4, a well-designed race crossing doesn't have to cause anybody any pain, whatever vehicle they're in.
Yeah.
So feel free to stay in there and keep writing if you want to, because I might take a screenshot of that one for later, because it's cool, very cool.
I'll get it.
We'll carry on. So when we're talking about inclusive design, there's different ways that we can frame things to tell the story and to keep our audience with us, whatever audience that is. And one of those ways is through Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit. There's a link to this in your resources in the learning module software thingy under this webinar. And so it talks about permanent, temporary, and situational impairments. A permanent impairment is something that doesn't change, obviously. So something that somebody either was born with a permanent impairment or something happens in their life and that injury or situation is not going to change for them for the rest of their life. Another kind of impairment is temporary. So the examples there are having a broken limb, which a lot of us can relate to. I know I had knee surgery once and I used crutches and a wheelchair for a while I was struggling, well, I'm not struggling, while I was recovering from that surgery. And a temporary impairment can give us some insight into challenges getting out and about, but it's really not the same as replicating the lived experience of somebody who has a permanent impairment, because it can almost be a bit of a novelty if you have crutches for a couple of weeks and you use a wheelchair from the shopping mall or something. It can be really interesting and provide you some insight into how that works. But the fact that it's temporary means that you don't get the full experience of what it's like to never have any other choices. You know that it's time limited. You have a lot of options, after when you've recovered. Your employment isn't usually affected by that situational temporary impairment. So that's just a word of warning to not overemphasize the value of trying out a wheelchair or having some kind of temporary impairment, because it's not the same as engaging with disabled people themselves. And then a situational impairment is something that's really every day. And the example I like to think of is, because I work from home a lot and I've got stairs in my house, I try not to walk downstairs with a mug of coffee too often, because I know one day I won't be paying attention and that's going to end in dirty carpet. So there's situations where we find ourselves encumbered with luggage or something. We might be in a really loud cafe, if you're trying to have a work meeting online or with people and it's really loud and you can't hear people very well. Or a common one is when you're traveling with small children, your own or other people's, and that becomes its own challenge, right? Just trying to get around in a way that is safe and comfortable and doesn't embarrass you or the people that you're with. So that can be quite a good way to explain this stuff to colleagues, because everybody can come up with examples typically of these kinds of impairments. And having said that, have a go in the chat. What do you think are some situational impairments that affect people crossing the street? So the example I will give is my coffee one, which is common crossing the street. You cross the street for a coffee sometimes. If you're carrying a coffee, or if you're carrying like 4 coffees for all of your workmates as well, which I often do, then you do not have as good balance. You don't have as much capacity to react to things. You can't maybe press the button if it's a signalized crossing. Oh, look, here we go. Everybody's got lots of examples. Using the phone, too many beers. That's not even in the list, but that's a really great and common situational impairment. Not even necessarily too many beers. Once you've had some alcohol, then you're not the same in terms of your alertness and judgment as you were before you started drinking. Chatting to your mate, that's interesting. We'll come back to that when I talk about driver behavior. Being tired, yep. Mind elsewhere. Being tired or being stressed is really good. I wonder if anyone has had an experience of walking somewhere when they're really stressed. You really feel like your world is closed in, right, to behind your eyes. I often think about that if I'm walking somewhere and I'm thinking about something, or if you recently had a death in the family or someone close to you, then you find that your world closes in, and that almost literally happens inside people's brains, because what we take in from the world is not what's there, it's what our brain interprets. And if our brain is preoccupied with something, then we take in less and less of what's actually there. So that's being tired or being stressed is a really good one. Running on Strava, do you want to explain that one for us, Prue? Are you trying to get the overall record speed time or something?
Yeah, there is. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it, and hasn't happened recently, but when you're like trying to get your average pace up, then you're just not paying attention to other things as much. Totally. And it's like, I didn't think that runners would do that. And then when I was recording on Strava, I went, oh yeah, actually safety standards.
Yeah, definitely. I found that happens when I was biking home when my son was younger and I had to be at school a certain time to pick him up. If you're trying to get somewhere quickly, whatever mode you're using, then you're, again, got this kind of tunnel vision, right? And you're not noticing the things that you would if you were more relaxed. Super interesting.
I'd like to add magpies too. And magpies in there, that's a situational impairment.
Yeah, definitely. When you're scared
big
about
one right now.
Animals. Yep. Definitely.
Do you have magpies in New Zealand?
We do. We have the same seasonal problems with them dive bombing cyclists and stuff. And people try all sorts of countermeasures. Yeah. This is great.
Distracted by someone else's dog. You're used to.
Yeah. We had someone comment the other day about when we're talking about the benefits of walking, someone said you might see a dog. And I've been thinking about that ever since, whoever that was. It was so good. It's such a great benefit, but it can be a challenge and a distraction as well, right? Depending on the dog and the dog's personal situations and constraints. That dog might be under stress for all we know, and that affects us. So, you know, all of these things you don't learn in civil engineering school, and this is why you're here, because it's awesome.
Actually, I was looking at some data collected from communities and mapping it all of the key themes, and I actually have a special map that is dog issues. So
it comes up a lot. Yep, comes up a lot when we're talking to people in neighbourhoods about why they do and don't walk places and which streets they do and don't use. There's a dog down there, I'm not going there. Very common. I remember when I was doing my paper run when I was 11. I used to creep past this house because there was always a dog sleeping in the front yard, but not tethered to anything, and I was terrified. So yeah, trauma. Okay. So if you have questions about any of this stuff that you want to discuss, feel at any time you can put them in the chat. We're going to have a specific break coming up to look at some of those questions. So as you can tell by now, Prue and I can talk all day about a wide variety of topics. So if you don't want us to sidetrack this conversation, then feel free to put something that you'd like to talk about or us to talk about in the chat. So this slide is talking about why I think we're not doing inclusion very well. And you remember when I said that inclusion is written into policy in both of our countries? We don't really have any way to measure that. So when it's written into policy and road safety, we say Vision Zero, it's not acceptable for people to be killed on our roads. Therefore, we're going to invest in road safety and we're going to know whether it's done any good because we can measure crashes and we know where they happen. We know how severe they are. We have a really good understanding of the role of infrastructure interventions to affect road safety. So that whole system from policy right through to construction and monitoring works to tell us whether we're doing any good or not. When it comes to inclusion, we say we have to design transport for all people to get where they're going easily and with comfort. We don't have any outcome to measure that, so it just stays as words in a policy that sound really nice, and we have no way of knowing if they're doing any good. So it's just on all of us at the moment to be good people and to do some of that stuff. There are some cases more in Australia of legal consequences if places are not made accessible, but we don't have any way to prioritise investment within a community at the moment depending on inclusion stuff. And Prue's going to talk more about where to put raised crossings in her module, including engaging with people, because it's a good thing to do. But at the moment, we don't have any way to answer that in terms of measuring where people are and are not participating. So what I mean by that is if we've got a local shopping centre and we're looking at the neighbourhood and saying, where should we put raised crossings? At the moment, we can't look at a map of where pedestrians do and don't cross the street and who those pedestrians are. Imagine if we did that, if you had a Google Maps layer to say, okay, I'm a blind person, I need to get from here to here. Where do all the other blind people go who live around here? Or how do we know from their patterns of walking where the most likely accessible routes are? If we had that map, you can imagine we could see the gaps in accessibility and how people can and can't get to those shops. And that could be another layer in our decision-making process about where to put the raised crossings to fulfill that objective of inclusion. And Bridget's recommended inclusion outcome, as I've said already, is equity of participation. Who is getting there and doing stuff? Who is not? How can we use this data to understand where to put crossings and what the impact of those crossings are on people's participation, on all people's participation? Otherwise, it just stays as nice policy words and we can't target investment effectively. So let me know if that makes sense to you, if you've got questions about that. We've started doing some more work on that in New Zealand. In fact, I've got a graph I should show you, Prue, on where people who use manual wheelchairs do and don't go in central Auckland based on the gradient of the footpaths. So we asked 20-something people who use wheelchairs, which streets do you use and not use? Well, how about this one? Is it easy or difficult, or can you not use it? And from that, we made a graph that says basically any footpath over a length of about a block. If it's above about 4% average gradient, then that's going to be difficult for most people who use wheelchairs to use, and so most of them will avoid it if they can. That's interesting, right? Because then you can map your town centres and you'll know, based on gradient, where people who use wheelchairs can and can't typically go. And it's going to be very similar for people who are pushing a pram, people who are carrying luggage, people who are tired. And so you can use that to say, well, okay, given that, this route's probably out because that's 8% gradient. If we're going to put an accessible crossing, we should put it over here because that's going to attract the most people because it's on a part of the city that they're already using. That's the kind of information that I'm interested in. So here we are. Does anybody have any questions while I eat some nuts?
Well, I've got questions. I keep thinking back to that, or just thinking about how we so commonly, we establish that we will design for that garbage truck on every street. And for larger trucks, we establish that we will do that. We won't discriminate against any garbage trucks. And yet we don't have the same guidance. Our guidance is full of information, like, and think about the needs. If people with disabilities or children or people with prams might be there, it's like, no, not if. They will be there. Some of your users will be these users. So, this is how we're designing.
My current kind of curiosity is when we say, and some of you might have said it, and I might have said it myself in the past as well, we should think about whether there are rest homes in the area. Well, actually, my dad lived in a rest home for about 4 years, and those people don't get out very much. If you're measuring equity of participation, we should be looking at where all people do and don't go, and where there are gaps in their journeys. Because it feels quite good to put a raised crossing outside a rest home, but I have never seen data about their participation. In fact, people who live in aged residential care are excluded from New Zealand's household travel survey because they don't travel very much. They literally might get out on average once a week for a walk around the block, which means they're not crossing any streets. So you might get more return on investment if you put that raised crossing on an arterial road that is 800 metres away from a primary school. It's not right outside the gate because the traffic's all slow and calmed there anyway at school time, but it would help hundreds of children to walk to that school independently. So there's these bigger questions about who goes where and who are they? Yeah, what are their needs? And
even we'll talk more about that, in the next session when we talk about where, but I think a common theme that is coming out of this is that, it's talking to people, it's giving people agency over being able to make choices about their decisions. I know working for lots of councils, there's requests for paths and better crossings coming in. And, if I see those requests, it's like, oh, great. Well, we know people want to go here. This is something we know about. So let's jump and get moving and explore the option.
Yeah, so there's this one question here from Matthew. Do current design guidelines around flat areas of slopes meet what disabled people need? Well, actually, that's where that research in Auckland came from about what kinds of slopes can disabled people navigate at a city block level, because we're wondering whether shared paths that are walking and cycling paths, whether they really need those flat areas if you're 3 kilometres away from the closest residential area or car park or footpath. So what I'm saying is that if you use a manual wheelchair, are you likely to go for a 3 kilometre excursion on one of those paths? And can you handle that gradient over that length such that these ramps are necessary? So my research suggests no, I actually don't think that those flat areas on slopes and recreational shared paths are that useful, because they are quite uncomfortable for cyclists, and there are a lot of disabled cyclists as well. So that's the answer to that. I'll quickly answer the next one and then we'll go into the next section. Do I think people in rest homes are travelling less due to personal characteristics or owing to gaps in provision for journeys? I think both. Certainly, I think there is variation in the amount of travel that people want to do and feel inclined to do. And when you don't have much energy, then you're not, if traveling is difficult for you, then you're probably going to travel less than other people. So even generally, you're going to try and do more things with one trip than somebody like me who's like, oh, I'm out and about all the time. I nip down to the shops because I like the journey and it's good for me and fun. If traveling is difficult, then you'll travel less. But also 100%, I think that there are gaps in accessibility of journeys around rest homes and hospitals. If you're in a hospital, my dad was in hospital for a couple of weeks, I thought about this a lot. It's really hard to find an accessible route to take someone from hospital for a bit of fresh air for 20 minutes. It's not usually well advertised. It's not obvious at all where to go and how to get back. And so I think we need more evidence about these things. And that's where we ask people, is there a trip you haven't made? I think I come back to that later, or maybe it's another talk. Asking people at what they'd like to do and where they'd like to go is the way to answer that question.
Got one more there about motorized, about using mobility vehicles. Have you got motorized mobility vehicles at the moment? Is this opening up or, creating opportunities to provide for people in areas where there are those kind of longitudinal gradients that we can't overcome? How do you think we should be thinking about that?
So people who use like mobility scooters, is that what we mean? Like,
yeah, like the gophers, they're sometimes called.
Yep.
They've got all different names in different places.
And there's all different changes all the time, new technologies. There's a lot of people who have powered wheelchairs that can navigate all sorts of slopes. So those people can usually travel regardless of gradient. It's a bit like having an electric bike. The hill slope doesn't bother you anymore so much. So typically if you use a motorized mobility vehicle, then those recreational paths are fine for you, as are most city streets. Auckland does get very steep at some points, and I don't know, some of them powered wheelchairs can't navigate some of those gradients up sort of past 8, 9, 10%. But yeah, recommend more research, right? Because everyone asks me these things all the time. I'm like, there's no data, we need to find out. So we'll move on. This is a bit of a tangent into human behavior in traffic. And this goes back to what we were saying about people behaving differently when they're stressed or tired or their mind is on other things. And I was very interested in that. So it became my PhD topic because, as you can guess by now, I'm quite curious about mind and other people's perspectives and how we can study that as scientists. So my PhD topic was to look inside the driver's wandering mind. In fact, that was one of my journal articles, was called that, Inside the Commuting Driver's Wandering Mind. I wanted to know what drivers are thinking about, how often they're thinking about driving, and how that affects road safety. So this is related to what we're talking about with raised crossings because it connects all of these things. Why do we even have engineering design standards? It's because drivers are not robots, and we need to account for the way that humans perceive and act on information that they're receiving from their eyes and ears and other senses. It affects where we put crossings because the whole concept of a forgiving, self-explaining environment is related to human cognition and how people do and don't see the world when they're thinking about it and when they're not thinking about it. And visibility diagrams and reaction times are also based on the human's ability to take in information and react to it. And it turns out that those things are relevant whether somebody is thinking about what they're doing or not. And the reason this topic was interesting to me is because I drive a car and I'm not paying attention to driving all the time. And I can guess that all of you who drive are exactly the same. You might think, oh, it's embarrassing. Oh, I feel guilty. Oh, I have to remind myself to pay attention. 100% of people that I studied are humans and their mind wanders some of the time, and here's some of the evidence for that. Given that this is a road safety kind of topic and I'm interested in road safety, I wanted to link this to safety, because when I say what's the effect of mind wandering on road safety, it's affecting road safety already, right? If people's minds are wandering now, then there's some link with crashes. It's not like we can just tell everyone to pay attention and all the crashes would go away. I wanted to understand where that boundary was. And that was triggered by this billboard, which I saw on State Highway 29 in New Zealand just before I started studying. It said, "Wandering minds cause crashes." And I was like, How on earth do you know that? Have you interviewed every driver who has crashed and asked them what they were thinking about when they crashed? And if you did, that's a really dodgy research method, because I don't think they would tell you with much accuracy. I can't tell you what I was thinking about 5 minutes ago when I ate those nuts. You know, it's a very unreliable thing to do. So how can you conclude that it's the wandering mind that causes crashes when my mind wanders all the time and I've never crashed? Let's study this. So there is safe behavior and unsafe behavior, and there is thinking about driving and thinking about other things. But those things aren't on the same axis, right? It's not necessarily safe just because you're thinking about driving. And the classic example is boy racer speeding down an arterial road. They're thinking about driving pretty intently, but they're not necessarily safe. At the other end, unsafe behavior isn't necessarily the same as thinking about other things. You could be a very relaxed and competent driver cruising up a motorway, and you've been going for 45 minutes and you're thinking about what's on the radio. It doesn't mean you're necessarily unsafe. So I wanted to explore that interaction, especially this one. How come we can all drive safely with our mind wandering? How does that even work? And this is probably the best slide of the whole thing, isn't it, Prue? Because it's got these very funny quotes in it. There's this website called Papers Past in New Zealand, and you can literally just search for any term you want, and it will tell you if it's been in a newspaper in the last 100 years in New Zealand. So I searched daydreaming and driving, and this is what it told me. And the best one is in the bottom left. Driving is a full-time job. If there is any place in the world where silence is really golden, it is in the driver's seat. When the tongue wags, the mind lags. Driving cannot safely be combined with sociability, lovemaking, sightseeing, window shopping, or daydreaming. And it was really curious to me that that author lumped in daydreaming with lovemaking as things that shouldn't happen while driving. And I was like, well, I've done one of those things when I was driving a car and I got there safely. So I wonder about everyone else in the population and what they are thinking about. And at the time when I started, 2012, there was only one paper about mind wandering, and that's what they said. It's associated with risk for crash involvement. And I was like, well, how do you know? So what do you think about when you're driving? If you don't drive, what do you think drivers think about? And I'm going to give you some examples of what drivers told me. So we'll see how prescient you are in terms of that kind of thing. Does anybody have any contributions to what you're thinking about when you're driving a car?
Arrival time. Definitely.
Food. Yep. What to have for dinner.
To stop for rest breaks. Directions. Now that's really hard. You have to navigate when you're driving if it's somewhere new.
Yeah, I don't think, well, even if it's not, you're constantly driving around your hometown thinking, which way will I go today? In Hamilton, we've got a river right through the centre of our city. So you've got choices about which bridge to cross, and you're like, oh, it's school holidays, but there's that event on, but this traffic in front of me looks, I'll go that way. So you're constantly thinking about things unrelated to the road in front of you, but nonetheless driving related. And so you can see where my spreadsheets got complicated in terms of trying to analyse what drivers were thinking about and whether that's driving related or not. Kids related, yes. So you are pretty good at knowing what drivers think about. And now you might want to turn up your volume, because this is a video of my study asking drivers what they think about, and it's got captions, so you don't have to be able to hear it. It is really quiet. So yeah, here it is. Some examples. That's me sitting in the passenger seat. What are you thinking about now? And they told me. And I had 30-something participants across 130 or so drives. Some of them were commuting to work and back, and these ones were all on a specific loop around Hamilton that I drove them on. So just pretty much just say nothing until I had to ask them my question. These are some of the examples of what people said. They're driving in their own car, and I just set up this GoPro on a little rig. Got my clipboard, so I'm very serious, professional.
Definitely. Not sure where your collar is.
This is a video of Bridget's hairstyles over time. And as you can see here, people are thinking about very everyday things. somebody getting close, that's a really common one. People are triggered by a kind of interruption to what they perceive as their bubble of safety. This is my theory anyway, that we all have a kind of tolerance for how close other drivers are. And when they get too close, we start thinking about it. That's the first thing that happens. And then we decide whether we need to keep thinking about it or act on it, right? And that's why humans are so amazing at this stuff. So in conclusion, 5 years later, how often do drivers' minds wander? Pretty frequently. I think 1/2 to 2/3 of the time on familiar drives on urban roads. I think it's probably closer to 80 or 90% of the time in your own car on a familiar drive on a rural road where you're not having to make any driving decisions for a long time. And all drivers, well, all human drivers report mind wandering at least occasionally because it's human. And as I said, you even have to think about where you're going to park your car, which is not related to the driving scene right in front of you at the time. So it's a pretty amazing adaptive skill, humans being able to drive and get there safely most of the time. So we can't stop drivers' minds wandering. What we can do about it is design environments where that's okay. So this is a pretty common place for drivers to report mind wandering. According to my studies, it was the most common. And it was just a long stretch of a pretty quiet kind of collector road in Hamilton. The drivers that I was with didn't have to make any turns or maneuvers for a few kilometres, so they were pretty relaxed at this point. And so what they said to me that they weren't really thinking of much, they were hungry, thinking about dogs, pretty common kinds of things for drivers to think about. Whereas this really busy, constrained roundabout, it looks way more spacious than it actually is. This is called Five Crossroads. And everybody was paying attention at this roundabout, and they said things like, I hate this roundabout. 5 out of 25 used that exact phrase, I hate this roundabout. They didn't like it, they would avoid it. And so people were paying attention because the environment suggested to them that, that they should do that. So it's not so much that we should worry about whether we're paying attention or not. The important thing is how you regulate your attention. I've already started training my 15-year-old on this for when he learns to drive, and actually just everyday life, right? This is the School of Life book. It's about understanding where your energy is and being self-aware enough to know when you're slipping and when you're, you know, the equivalent of a little bit drunk, you're a little bit tired or stressed or distracted. When have you gone over your own threshold of being able to regulate your own attention so that you wake up in the right places? And designing a raised crossing is a perfect response to this, because we wake people up right at the point where they need to be awake because there might be people crossing the street right in front of them. So there's a lot of cognitive science actually in why we promote raised crossings, and really why I was so keen to be part of this webinar series, because they're just such an excellent response from the human pedestrian perspective, providing for all people, and from the driver behaviour, road safety perspective, and accounting for the way that people are actually driving around our towns and cities. So having said all of that, I think there are 4 kinds of drivers. I think some people report paying attention a lot more than others. This is not me. There's some people who I took for drives, and I believe that they pay attention closer to 80 to 90% of the time. They're just wired that way, and they are just really diligent and sometimes quite driving anxious. Like they might just, they care a lot more about it. They think about it more than other people. Some people report thinking about driving a lot because they're a little bit they're bad drivers. They stay really close. They want to win. They want to get there as fast as possible. So they're always trying to choose what lane they're in, and they're thinking about driving a lot, but they're not necessarily very good. Most people are competent cruisers like me. We have very good attentional regulation. So we pay attention when we need to. We have really good habits. So we leave good gaps between us and other traffic. We stay at safe speeds, which means that we daydream, but it doesn't have a bad road safety consequence. And then there's a small proportion of people, one of whom I think I was in a car with, who are not good at regulating their attention, and they daydream inappropriately at the wrong times and don't necessarily wake up to the same triggers that other people do. And you'll all know these people in your lives. My sister's one of them. I can't tell her that because she won't believe me, but some people just really shouldn't be driving a car despite the fact that they pass their test, because they're just not wired to regulate their attention very effectively, but they're not likely to have very serious crashes because they're not boy racers going too fast. Engineering and planning can help with attentional regulation because something like a raised crossing wakes the drivers up and keeps speeds low so that whatever they're thinking about, we're unlikely to kill or injure people by mixing them all together. So does that make sense? I think I've got a question here about what kind of driver you think you are. So you feel free to put that in the chat or to ask any questions about humans and their wandering minds. We've got a break coming up shortly. But pop something in the chat if you're curious. I'd expect most of you to be competent cruisers. I think probably 80% of people are. Yeah, I think maybe one or two of those clumsy daydreaming ones. There's quite a lot in New Zealand, especially, we know from questionnaires, who are competitive, rule breaking, pushing the boundaries kind of people, maybe 10%, quite a lot. And then another few percent who are really good, diligent drivers.
Yeah. Overcautious sometimes. I've got a comment. I would call that the diligent driving instructor, would you?
Yeah. Yep. Overcautious is different from this kind of clumsy, lacking awareness of the fact that they're not very good. And those kind of people, like I say, they just don't leave good gaps. They don't tend to look for long enough at intersections. You can just tell after you've driven in the car 138 times with people asking what they're thinking about, whether you trust them as a driver or not. Competent and courteous. Well, that's a nice word. Just a nice person. That's good. Most people are, right?
With these diligent and competent cruiser, it takes a lot more energy to be diligent. I find, I use a lot more energy, but driving is something that I find really tiring. Whereas
100%. That's exactly why people do this. That's exactly why minds wander, because our brains have evolved to be lazy and to conserve energy. So putting energy into something is really tiring. And I remember once my most energy sapping drives are when I've been in the dark in a storm. You're driving in the dark in a storm, and if it's either heavy traffic, or once I drove on a road that was likely to be closed for slips because it's a hilly, forest environment, I was, people talk about white knuckle, where your energy is in your surging around your body. Like, that's literally draining from your brain, and it makes you tired for sure. You get to the end of the drive and you're like, oh, you can breathe out again.
Yeah,
definitely. So we've got some engineers, nobody across all of these 800 thought samples said to me that they were thinking about, time to collision or visibility splays or anything like that.
Bridget, I don't know what to make of this. I need a category a little below competent cruiser called karaoke king.
Oh, singing is totally a part of healthy regulation of attention. I think singing keeps you engaged in the drive, keeps you relaxed. It's the same with eating and drinking. I don't think they're necessarily bad things to do, because the message from all of this is to drive fresh, and whatever keeps you fresh and relaxed and alert is a good thing.
Okay, sing away.
Yeah. So that's, as I say, why raised crossings are so good, both from a pedestrian's perspective and also slowing the traffic down and waking the drivers up. So I've rearranged this billboard, or rewritten it, to say, concentrate, failure to account for drivers' wandering minds causes crashes. But I haven't seen that on any state highways just yet. I think it's better to put up in our government organisations so that we train all of the transport people to design more raised crossings. So having said all of that, yeah, that's what we're doing. And we've got time for a break. What do you reckon, Prue? 4 minutes?
I think we'll do 4.5.
Okay.
I don't know why I said that.
Back here by 8 past the hour.
8 past the hour. Yeah.
Okay, great. See you all soon.
Oh, I'm really tired. Tired. Just a reminder for people to do their homework. So you can find that under module 1 in the learning management system.
It's 9 past. Keep going?
Yep.
Okay. We can stop looking at my pictures of Paris cafes.
It looks so good.
So good. I'm just going to send off a photo from my self-created street art walking tour of Paris that I did last year. It's like such a good day. Paris is very walkable. I don't remember many raised crossings, but the streets are also narrow and makes them slow. So many people around, drivers expect to see you. So this is going to touch on what the pedestrians are thinking about, and does that matter? Should we be putting up signs at all our raised crossings to say, pay attention before you cross the street, or not? My friend Ilsa, who's a traffic psychologist, studied this as part of her PhD, and she surveyed people walking down this street before and after she put up this sign, which just says welcome to the street. And she asked pedestrians whether they had noticed the sign, and then she wrote down what they did about the sign. So because it's in the Netherlands and the sign is on the right, that's where people are walking. It's a busy street, so people had to walk around this somehow. Nobody collided with it. And she found that most people did not notice the sign, but nonetheless they avoided it. So in other words, they are mind wandering while walking, which is kind of the point of walking, right? If you go back for centuries, you go for a walk, people will say it clears your head. We've got evidence of people throughout history, creative geniuses saying they had their best ideas while they were walking. And there's some science in cognitive psychology about how that actually happens. They call it creative incubation, where when you're switched off from focusing intently on something, your mind is working in the background to make connections and to figure stuff out. And so that's why people have these eureka moments, and you might say, this thought occurred to me in the shower, or it occurred to me before I fell asleep, or when I was out for a walk or a bike ride. There is just this magic kind of cogitation effect of not focusing on something that keeps your brain ticking over and making its own connections. So the conclusion of that is we don't need to tell pedestrians to pay attention. We need to design environments where it doesn't actually matter if they are or not, which doesn't mean that we train kids to run out in front of traffic. It means we train kids to regulate their attention, just like we train people to drive a car. This is where you need to look. And once they're used to looking, they will look even if they're not specifically thinking about it. So it's more about where people are looking and what information is going into their brain. It doesn't matter so much whether it goes through the conscious part of their brain. Does that make sense to people? You can be looking and reacting and behaving appropriately, even if you're not thinking about the thing that you're looking at. So that's the message there. We don't need to worry about telling drivers to pay attention, or even so much telling them not to have headphones in. Using a phone is a little bit different, because then you're not actually looking either, right? Like if you're crossing the street and looking at your phone, and you're not even allowing that unconscious loop in your head to activate. So it's important that we train people not to be looking at their phone when they're walking around, and especially crossing the street, but listening to music and having a phone on you is not so much of a problem usually. What about cycling? This is just an excuse to put my picture of my bike trailer and my cello in this webinar series. I think cycling is a similar kind of thing to walking, right? And I've got an exercise here where I'm going to ask you to think about this as well. So this is my guesses, because there hasn't been enough research in walking and cycling and what people are thinking about when they do those things. Obviously, I concluded from my research that most everyday driving involves lots of mind wandering. And I think, you know, if you're walking for recreation, literally going for a walk in the woods or something, then you're there so that your mind can wander, and that's lots of daydreaming happens then as well. But At the other end of the spectrum, my friends who are blind will say that they have to concentrate when they're walking because their life depends on it, right? They don't want to walk out into the street. They're constantly on the alert for obstacles in the way. So they have to pay attention a lot when they're walking, and it's not a very relaxing experience. So we're going to go back into Miro, and we're going to do a very specific thing now that you're very good at Miro. And I want you to go to Miro exercise 3. Oh, look, here you all are. And write a sentence just like this. I want to start with the word a and then describe a person. So you might say, a tired person driving, and then in this situation, a tired person driving to work, for example, or a sleepy person cycling in the forest, or a happy person walking on the beach. Pick some combination of adjective, transport mode, and situation, and then put them on this continuum. Do you think that person is going to be daydreaming or paying attention? Excellent. Good job, people. I like the example, even though it's sad, of a grieving person, because we can't get more human than that, right? Like, people are going to grieve and they're going to drive sometimes. So it's so natural and appeals to our compassion to understand that somebody who's driving while grieving is not necessarily going to be paying as much attention to the road as they would when they're not grieving. And this is what we mean about designing for humans as they are, as they present themselves in the world, and not as automatic robot attention devices. Because, you know, it's interesting to me, even if you were going to pay attention when you're driving, what are we supposed to be paying attention to? Is it the road in front of us? Is it the road behind us? Is it the side streets? Is it whether there's pedestrians running out? Is it where we're going and how we're best going to get there? Or is it the weather and whether we should be up increasing our windscreen wiper fluid? There's so many different parts of driving to think about. If you had a kind of spreadsheet or Alexa telling you, okay, pay attention to the driver in front, think about the driver behind, there is a side street coming up, like, you'd just turn off that alerter thing, wouldn't you? Because it'd be so annoying. You're like, Alexa, it's fine, I can drive. I don't need to be told what to think about every 3 seconds, because that's the kind of complexity that it would end up creating. So what have we got here, Prue?
Sorry, I'm just doing a couple of technical things in the background. So
that's cool. I'll read some of them. So we've got,
yep.
And they're not much mind wandering. So these are the people who are paying attention. A policeman directing traffic. Yeah, police people, I've done a presentation about this for the police because they are really skeptical when you say that drivers can daydream and it's fine. Because a police, they're like the embodiment of the diligent driving instructor, right? They want you. In fact, they'll often tell you if they pull you over. So I've been told, I don't get pulled over, but take care, pay attention. And we often have messages like that in the radio, you know, approaching long weekends. Everyone needs to pay attention this weekend. It's going to be busy. As opposed to what? You can switch off on the other weekends when it's not busy? I don't really understand. But police people will probably be paying attention, or if they're in pursuit, they'll be paying attention because then they switch into that boy racer kind of persona. A focused driver in Formula One. Oh, Formula One drivers, that's a whole other area. So me and my supervisor think that there are some people who have specific access to their unconscious process when they're doing some expert task, well-practiced task. And we think a racing driver is that kind of person. So you imagine there are the equivalent of like a virtuoso cellist who plays cello for a living, and they've played for decades and they practice hours a day. They get to the point where they can actually monitor what their unconscious habits are doing at that time. That's what expertise kind of is. They've got special access to those skills that mere humans don't. So yeah, a driver in Grand Prix will be concentrating on a lot of things, but I guarantee their perspective is different from just us if we were chucked on a racetrack, because they're so in tune to how that all works. Now, over the other side, lots of mind wandering. A tired person driving to the mountain on a Friday night, well, that's pretty risky, isn't it? That comes to mind to me as risky. And when people say tired, the reason I say that that's risky is because there's something you can do about that. You can not drive tired, or you can pull over for a rest, or you can make sure that you're refreshed and hydrated. And in fact, if I was going to replace that billboard that I saw that said wandering minds cause crashes, I would say, drive fresh, alert drivers are the safest, or something like that, because that's something that we can do to give our conscious and our unconscious brains the best chance of working together effectively. That's what it's about. A cool person walking through a dog park. Yeah, I like that. They're just cruising, they're daydreaming, they're fine, they're in a park, right? A relaxed driver going for a short known destination. Yep, there's a certain link to familiarity. The more familiar you are with the streets, at a general level as well as specific. And what I mean by that is I could go to Caloundra, where Prue lives, and there will be streets there that feel familiar to me just because of the way that they're designed, the combination of buildings and lane markings and traffic and modes and people. It's not actually that different from the streets that I am familiar with, that I've driven on thousands of times. So it's not like if I'm in a new environment like Caloundra that I'm necessarily going to be paying 100% attention. I'll probably be on holiday. I'll probably be excited because I'm meeting Prue for ice cream or something. And so I'll be thinking about that. Whereas if you put me on a mountain road in the Himalayas, I'll be paying attention, right? Because that's completely unfamiliar and my brain's like, whoa, there's so much to take in, and it switches me on to all of that. I get very excited about this and I'm probably going to run out of time, so I'll move on. But thank you for your contributions. Now we're going to go into this SOS, which you've actually already been told what it means in one of the slides previously, if you were paying attention. If anybody knows what this means, you can quickly write it down in the chat and you will get a prize if you know what SOS stands for. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. I'm going to eat some more nuts.
I'm back in Queensland. I think it's
Hillary.
Go Hillary.
Somebody's heard it before. Amazing. Well, yeah, that too.
Another one to New Zealand. Okay, you're on the list, Hillary.
Safe, obvious, and step-free. I've also added smooth to S, but same difference. These principles, this is my legacy to the transport profession from my career. Came up with this acronym after interviewing probably about 100 disabled people when I was helping Waka Kotahi with pedestrian design guidance. I'm trying to consolidate everything that disabled people said about walking into a simple kind of catchphrase that designers could use to check what they're designing to make sure that it's inclusive. And I'm going to go through what all of these different words mean. Safe is what we know best. It means survivable speeds. So that means that if somebody's on a road, that the traffic is not going to kill them if the driver makes a mistake. If somebody's on a path, it means that cyclists aren't going to come up from behind them and bowl them over. And it also means feeling safe. And that comes up quite a lot, especially in the shared path or shared street example. We want people to feel that they're not going to be in danger of being collided with, even if the evidence suggests that the crashes are quite rare. Feeling safe is really important, because if people don't feel safe, they won't go there. And if they don't go there, then they might not go out at all. And that comes back to that equity of participation question. So feeling safe and comfortable is probably met by this criteria, even though this isn't a priority crossing. It probably would be more safe if it was in some ways, because drivers are more likely to stop for people, but it meets these criteria. The speeds will be survivable and we're slowing and separating different kinds of modes. Obvious is my favorite of the words in the SOS, because it's not the most obvious to transport professionals when we're designing things. And that's because we see the world through the manual of traffic control devices, and we understand what road markings and signs all mean. And we see them, we literally see them in our brains. Whereas if I took my mum out on the street and I said, hey mum, see that edge marker post, she'd be like, what's that? We have a different way of seeing and interpreting the world than the public. So we need to check ourselves that our designs are obvious, and raised crossings with zebra markings on them are a really obvious thing to people. They recognize it as a crossing. But this one is not a raised crossing. This is just in a car park in Hamilton. It's not even a formal crossing because it's not a formal road. Does that affect how obvious it is? I would say no. I think that people who are walking around here, they march straight across that crossing because it's a car park, really slow environment. The drivers will give way to them. They don't care that it's not a legal pedestrian crossing. The zebra markings are a universal symbol of priority for pedestrians, and they're really, really obvious. So we're already coming across a problem that something that's obvious but not safe is going to result in pedestrian injuries. And in the old days, I don't even see so many anymore because we raise them now in Hamilton where I live. But we used to design mid-block signalised crossings like this. We're flush with the road, so the traffic can zoom through. If it doesn't notice that there's a crossing there, or they choose not to obey the signals for some reason, they're distracted, then you quite often have traffic going through here up to 60 k's plus per hour on a 50k street, because humans are humans, and it means that even though it's really obvious, it's not safe, and that's a problem for us. What about asphalt art? Is this obvious that it's a crossing point or not? And I would argue that it's not obvious, because a lot of children and a lot of adults with learning disabilities and a lot of people unfamiliar with the street in the area might assume that that's just part of the public plaza and not part of the street. So guidance on where to put art in street environments is pretty rapidly shying away from putting it in live traffic lanes. Put street art in parking spaces, in the berms, off the street, of course, on buildings, but don't put it in a live traffic lane if you can get away with it. And S stands for smooth, step-free choices. So we're pretty familiar with this as well. As designers, we know that routes should be free of steps, but it also means that we don't have too much gravel, and including temporary traffic management, that we aren't sending people through places that they're going to get stuck. If you use a manual wheelchair, it's not just the fact that it's tricky to navigate and it's bumpy, but if you use a manual wheelchair, you're pushing the wheels with your hands, and if you're going through the mud, that means your hands are going to get muddy, right? Because you're literally grabbing the wheels all the time, and that's super uncomfortable, and it can actually stop people from using a street. So this includes temporary traffic management and diversions as well. Oh, look, here's my graph that I didn't know I'd put in there. So this is not public yet, but anyway, it's data. So this is what I was saying about the streets of Auckland, and we interviewed people, and we found that above a gradient of about 4%, people who use wheelchairs, most of them will have at least some difficulty navigating that street. And it's just amazing to me that I can't find this kind of graph anywhere else in the world. Nobody's actually talked to people who use wheelchairs and said, can you go up the street or not? That's pretty fundamental, isn't it? If we go back to Prue's thought about having a design vehicle, a rubbish truck that we cherish above all other in street design, and yet when we're designing paths and roadways through areas of different geography and topography, we don't actually know how steep is too steep. Well, now we do. Thanks, Bridget. Hey, you're welcome. So having said all that, not all infrastructure needs to be safe, obvious, and step-free. It's not like we have to go and raise all of the steps and convert them to escalators. We can't afford to do that. And disabled people would rather that we prioritise getting everybody where they need to go in a way that is safe, obvious, and step-free, and advertising those accessible routes rather than focusing on a mass removal of steps investment, which may or may not be helpful. So as long as there are options between people's origins and destinations, then we can add other infrastructure as well. We might have refuge islands, for example, like there's one near this street in this picture. There's a refuge island on quite a busy street, and I think it's actually quite a good idea because there's a signalized crossing kind of 150 meters either side. But for people who want to run across the road, let them run across the road and give people those choices. I don't actually think that's necessarily a bad thing. So we're going back into Miro, and we've got 4 examples of crossings here in exercise 4. And you can give it a grade with a post-it or a sticker that is like a trophy or a tomato or a kangaroo. I don't mind, for how safe, obvious, and step-free the crossing is. And while you're doing that, I'll answer this question in the chat because it's interesting. So Aria said with those grades, our building standard is a maximum gradient of 1 in 12 with 1 in 14 preferred. Yeah, and the difference is that those gradients are designed to be over really short distances. So if you've got a short distance, like a ramp up to a front door of a building, or an internal ramp in a building that avoids some steps, then 1 in 12 and 1 in 14 means basically almost everybody will be able to use that independently. But the streets that we have are different because they follow the hills that the earth is made from, right? We're not going to go and convert all of our cities to a 1 in 14 grade. So my question was, how far should we go in providing accessible routes if the street is already 6% or 8%? How can we design an accessible route from a train station at the bottom of Queen Street in Auckland to Aotea Square, which is, you know, several meters higher in above sea level? How do we get people between those two places in a way that's accessible for them? And where do they prefer to go now? And so how can we prioritize accessible routes and leave the ones that are too steep for the people who are confident and able to navigate them? So what I'd like to see is that we have street design guidance that says these things, that says where people can and can't go. So now I'm looking back into Miro and seeing what people have said. Oh, we've got lots of emojis. The top one, we're saying that's just a refuge island at a roundabout, and I agree with all of you that this is a horror. This is really common in New Zealand. We've got probably thousands of these. They're not great, and I'm glad that you've recognised that that's not best practice anymore. Kind of down the bottom one is somebody's got a, like, I don't know, emoji, and I actually quite like that because we've got a lot of these as well. Ideally, if we had all the money in the world, then we could put a raised crossing there, and then that would be beautiful. We don't necessarily have that, so I think that one at the bottom, it kind of depends. If you're going to upgrade it, it depends on the priorities. Is it a barrier to people getting where they need to go? Is it on a route to school for people? Is it close to, you know, an important shop for that community or an important park or something like that? And what are the traffic volumes and speeds? Maybe we could make it accessible just by fixing the curb cuts to make them nice and smooth. It might actually be that it's not too bad, or that street might be super busy and fast, in which case we might bump it up the list for priorities. So I'm glad that you're saying
Bridget,
that sometimes it depends. Yep.
I just think this is a fantastic question to ask. I was involved in updating the roundabout guidance in Queensland, which now requires raised crossings on it. But there was just so little evidence around the notion that pedestrians find roundabouts hard to cross, like to try to research that subject. And yet just the most basic kind of feeling of research we need is, you know, how safe do you feel crossing this road, or is this just like what you've asked? And then it becomes very obvious. But if you look at crash statistics, they're not particularly overrepresented, but there's guidance that I came across that said things like, put the crossing as far away from the roundabout as possible. So yes, still safe for pedestrians. But so I just think it's a great question, and something that talking to colleagues about these kind of subjects can give us a better idea of whether our own kind of judgments are in the realm of normal, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I did a little study about 10 years ago looking at who was crossing the street at a roundabout before and after we put raised crossings in. I can send you that data, because what was interesting is that after the raised crossings went in, we had something like 20% more people crossing the street, but 80% more people using mobility aids like wheelchairs and walking sticks. So it's really, you're doing it for inclusion as much as for pedestrian safety. We just need to count people more often and do intercept surveys to find out whether those people are disabled or not. Because I talked to someone who lived near there, and she said she didn't walk to the shop before the crossings went in. She drove there like 800 meters because she used a walking frame. She liked going for walks, but it just wasn't safe. She didn't have enough time to get across. After the raised crossing went in, she could walk to the shop. So like, what a result. But like you say, we don't have that evidence all nicely packaged up that we can use for business cases and things.
Yeah.
So this is great. I really like your use of emojis and stickers. We've got nice raised crossing. The one with signals here is my favorite because it's obvious and safe. It's slowing the traffic down. It's appropriate to use signals because there's 2 lanes on one of the approaches. We wouldn't necessarily want a zebra there. The one second from the bottom, it's almost perfect, apart from the fact that we don't recommend white on red anymore, because there is some problems some people have with contrast. They can't see the stripes because some people have a vision issue, which makes that difficult, especially when the markings start to fade. It's better to do white on black. There are some places in New Zealand where we've got red transverse kind of marking across the road approaching around crossing, which is fine. Do that if we want to, but keep white on black for the crossing itself. So here's an example on my slides of a crossing that is safe, obvious, and step-free, and it's a signalised one again. So this is in central Hamilton. I like this example because it's in the middle of a shared zone and a public square, and actually people can cross wherever they like, but for people who really rely on that obvious part of the crossing, then they can press a button and the traffic will stop for them. And I think that's a really nice solution. It's really important in shared spaces or spaces that are designed to be shared that we give that guidance, especially imagine if you're a blind person trying to navigate a big public square like that. It could be very uncertain, not have much confidence, but the confidence you get from pressing a button and hearing it, hearing your signal go green is really great and helps people get out and about and live their lives. So yeah, the conclusion of all of this is that raised crossings are safe, obvious, and step-free treatment. So what I've said is that raised crossings work for all people. It doesn't matter whether drivers' minds are wandering or not. They're conspicuous, so they're likely to wake a driver up. But even if they don't, they slow the drivers down so that everybody is safe in the event of someone making a mistake. And when we put zebra markings on them, they're the most obvious thing we can do for all road users. Everybody knows what they look like and what they're there for. So we talked when Hafez was doing his module about the why of raised crossings and including policy and the big picture. We want to design these crossings that are safe for all people, and all of them, remember, could be operating at less than perfect. Just you think about it, the next time you're out walking or driving, think about the fact that probably over half of the other drivers you see are daydreaming at that time. And one of my friends who is blind says that this fact terrifies him as a blind person, thinking that drivers aren't thinking about what they're doing. But hey, he's still alive, right? So these people, human brains are amazing, but we should be aware of that. And again, that's something I'll be telling my child when I'm teaching him to drive. When we think about where, it depends who is there right now and who might cross in the future. So I do think it's on us as an industry to start asking different questions, doing different surveys and measuring like these before and after outcomes from putting raised crossings in, seeing not only how many people are crossing the street, but what's the increase in diversity. There was another project, I know of a science project in Auckland where they installed a raised crossing near a shopping centre and they had a huge increase in people who use wheelchairs from that community getting out and about, making more trips than they did before, and also using active, like walking instead of driving because it was easier and actually more welcoming. So the standards that Ken's going to talk about and the practices that we use to design the technicalities of raised crossings, they depend on these human limitations that we've talked about, and so that's where design standards come from, even if the people who write them aren't cognitive psychologists. So I'm just going to go quickly at the last topic is about disability sector engagement and how, when, and how much to pay people for that, because it's a really important part of this whole area. So where we sit at the moment with transport decision making in New Zealand, you can see I'm quite a big picture person. I think about these things in kind of diagrams. We've got our Ministry of Transport and national agencies, we've got regional and local councils, we've got politicians, and we've got consultants and people who work in transport like all of us. We've got people who drive buses and run public transport contracts. We've got the construction sector. And then underneath this, we've got the community who we're designing for, right? And where do they fit in all of this? Well, like I said earlier, we have measures to account for most of our objectives in transport. We know whether we're doing a good job with road safety. To some extent with climate change, we can measure emissions and mode share. And we know how efficient our network is because we measure that ad nauseum. But we don't have any measure for inclusion. So until we get that, then we need to do something differently in terms of how we prioritise. Because when it comes to inclusion, like I say, we've got some policy, our design standards, like we've said, they include things like tactile paving and curb cuts and ramp gradients, and certainly for buildings. But we don't have good outcomes to know whether we're actually including all people. And in Aotearoa, and it's similar in Australia, our communities are different depending on a lot of things. And in New Zealand, 17% of our population is Māori, but this pictogram that I made shows that Māori are more likely to be disabled in every age. And actually, if you take working age Māori population, which is 15 to 64, 40% of those people identify as a disabled person. That's massive, and it's way bigger than the proportion of working aged European New Zealanders who identify as disabled. So our communities are all different and diverse, and we need to be talking with them so that we can answer some of these questions about, is this the best place to spend $250,000 on a new road crossing, or should we be putting it on the other side of the neighbourhood, closer to something else that people want to get to? So disability sector engagement can help us in the absence of some of those other measures. And there's a guide that I wrote with the disability community about this engagement. I'm going to go through a little bit of it, but it's also in your notes in the learning module stuff, and you can access it from there. If you can't find it, just send me an email and I can send it to you, or you can Google it. At the moment, we have this kind of reactive advocacy. That's just fancy words for saying people complain about stuff, and like Prue says, we have requests from community for things. We don't have a very objective way to decide where to put things and why. So this is what we need to do. We've got a location that we're thinking about changing the crossing or putting in something new. We need to first ask, do we understand whether this will impact disabled people? It's a bit like saying, do we understand whether a crossing will reduce crashes? And Hafez showed you some data on Tuesday to say that, yeah, we know that a raised crossing reduces crashes, and we know that in quite a lot of detail. So in terms of this activity, we might want to do some research. We know that this activity does affect disabled people, so we can go to the next step in our diagram. If it doesn't, we might be working on something like pavement material specification. Not every single thing we do in transport has to involve disability sector engagement, and we can ask that question at the start. If we think disabled people are impacted, like we're putting a new crossing outside a school, it's probably going to impact people. Does it affect specific local communities or population in the whole country? And examples of something that does not affect local communities is national policy. There's a new national policy statement coming out, or there's changes to national design standards. That doesn't mean you go door knocking on the local street to ask people their opinion, because they probably won't care or they won't understand what you're talking about. But disabled people's organisations and disability advocates are really good at reading policy and doing submissions on it. So when you're doing stuff that's affecting people at a population level, then it's organisations that you need to talk to. And in the paper that I wrote, it's got a list of New Zealand specific organisations that you can talk to. And in Australia, I recommend that you talk with People with Disability Australia. And if it's not them, they will point you in the right direction. If it does affect specific communities, like it's literally digging up a street, then we need to talk to local people. And in New Zealand, we can find those people through local disability organisations who are really well connected, and specifically since COVID, because a lot of disability organisations connected online through social media, through email lists and things. So it's actually easier than it used to be to find local disabled people to engage with on your project. And the advantage of doing all of this is, like I said earlier, with the example of people crossing the street, these stories can be really helpful when we're wanting to invest in something and we need to convince some local politicians that a raised crossing program is a good idea, for example. Those stories about how people can actually travel independently with crossings, or how they're not traveling now because it's too hard to cross the street, can be really useful to get things across the line. So that's what we've talked about today. Feel free to put any more questions in the chat, because we're going to have a bit of time shortly. But first, comment in the chat about something you've learned today, or something that you thought was interesting that you might not have thought about before. Why a raised crossing is a good design solution for all people, or what else is it about what I've said today that you thought has been useful or interesting? Put that in the chat and I'll go through the summary. These slides are all in your notes as well, of course. So inclusion is important in transport because the law obliges us to design for everyone. We've got policy and ethical obligations. I think, you know, that question that we all asked about a just transition and whether raised crossings are part of that. I think the ethics of that is going to come up a lot more in a climate change context. So if you're a chartered engineer like me, you have to sign a pledge every year to say, I'm going to abide by my professional body's code of ethics. And part of that says that we need to consider the social and environmental implications of our work. So saying that you're working on raised crossings, saying that you're engaging with disabled people, saying that you're considering the impacts of these things on the community, then that's really good evidence that you're acting as an ethical professional because you're considering the environmental and social implications of your work. So McLean said in the chat that it's okay to let your mind wander. That's a great outcome. I'm glad that you've come to that conclusion because I think the same thing. How about everybody else? Let me know what you've learned today or what you think is interesting or something new or something that you might want to share with your colleagues. I'm eating nuts while I wait for you to type.
I want to say that these exercises, Bridget, I find it really interesting. We don't always have a lot of opportunities to calibrate our judgment with other professionals in the industry. And when we have questions like this, choosing what types of crossings are safe, obvious, and step-free, it's kind of like a calibration exercise. And that's what I think with the participatory data too. I have a sense of what I feel is safe, and I can assess it using safe system principles or using the COSOS. But it's when you get, 20 people in a room and everybody's, saying this doesn't feel safe and this does feel safe, that you realize you're on solid ground with your kind of focus and investigations.
Yeah, I agree, because I think our design standards and tools and practices can take a while to catch up to the professional view and what we all think is best practice and how we want to keep pulling that best practice forwards. A lot of us get quite impatient and frustrated to see like a new street, a new subdivision designed, and it's not how we might have designed it. And so it's really cool to come together like this in a forum and, like you say, have that affirmation that actually most people know what good design looks like, and we want to challenge what we don't think is good. Cool.
There's a great comment here from Hillary. Raised crossings work for people whose minds are wandering by reducing speeds. People, oh no, it's moving up. People react to hazards on autopilot to some degree. That sign in the footpath study.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that Ilse studied was so interesting. She had people in a driving simulator and she was studying the effect of variable message signs on drivers' attention, because typically LED signs attract drivers' attention. That's why we use them, like especially flashing ones. So they'll say, warning, roadworks tonight, go a different way. So she had a simulator study where she had drivers drive the same route like 10 times, and there was a message sign that was just a billboard, like advertising, like an LED shopping something. And then the 10th or 12th time, she changed it to say, road closed ahead, follow detour. And so she checked, and most people followed the detour and some didn't. And the people who followed the detour, some of them didn't even know that there'd been a sign. So they had interpreted this sign and gone off the road and not even known that why they'd done that. It's so interesting, like how humans are so manipulable. That's not a word, but you know what I mean? Like once you understand how unconscious brains work, it's kind of scary how much we do without thinking. It's super interesting. Okay. As you've all gathered, raised crossings are related to driver behaviour because drivers' minds are wandering most of the time. They're conspicuous and they slow drivers down in any case. So they're just good things. Human states and traits are really important. I think we're moving pretty rapidly as a professional community to understand that humans are all different and we have different motivations. I think there's also an evolving awareness that our profession doesn't represent the communities we're designing for. We're all relatively privileged people. We're much higher educated than the general population. We have a different lens on the world and therefore the priorities than our communities might have. So we need to get better at understanding that and putting some of these things in maps and graphs and diagrams and tools that our peers and decision makers can understand and use to make good decisions. I think, I'm not sure, I'll check in the resources whether there's information that you can use for your own area to create something like that pictogram that I had about the age structure of your population. and ethnicity information and disability statistics, because they're all can be quite useful. A lot of the time I've presented to local councils about their own statistics and they haven't even known. For example, in New Zealand, we can get stats about how many people in a community have access to a car. How many households have access to a car? That's something we ask in our census. And giving that information to local councils is often the first time they've seen it, even though it's just sitting there and publicly available. SOS stands for safe, obvious, smooth, step-free choices, and I'm glad you all know that. So that's the end for today. I won't see you again in this series, so do feel free to stay in touch and email me or connect on LinkedIn if you have any questions. I see there's just one here again. Who you have in mind when reviewing a design? I said that I have, this is related to a project I've been working on to map accessibility, and we're designing ways to, or assumptions to make about whether streets are usable for a blind person, a person using a manual wheelchair, and an 8-year-old child. Those are the three that I keep in mind, and I think they pretty much cover you know, almost all humans in terms of the cognitive capacity people have, the physical abilities people have, and blindness, I think, is a particularly important case to consider, because we really do design our world for sighted people, you know, more so than others. There's other things to consider as well, of course, but if you have those three in mind, if those three people can use your street, you really, really got a good street. You're really most of the way there to having an accessible, inclusive place. And it's likely to be pleasant for the rest of people as well, right? It's just going to be comfortable and easy and inviting, which is the goal. Great.
I'm going to try and put a link to the Zippy-Deeing 3-year-old as well, the triangle with that one as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Zipper-D. Zipper-D all day long.
So let me see. We've got that one. I have also, I just checked, and I don't think that information is in the resources,
Okay.
Bridget, about how people can do that.
Yep.
But
I'll find
a reminder to everybody to do your homework tasks. So that involves going for a walk and then filling out a short survey about your walk, and also about, we have a hypothetical scenario. So in the next session, we'll be going through some of the results of the survey that give you an idea of how we can plan and use that kind of participatory model for deciding where we need our crossings, where we're putting crossings in. So if you've done that, you'll have the experience of being a participant in that survey, but also then you'll flip to the other side of being someone who's receiving the results and looking at the data and seeing how that can inform your decisions. So that's all from me. If you have any problems, then email through and we can help you with that.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the series. Be in touch if you've got any other questions or you just want to chat, because obviously I like talking about all of this stuff. And see you all around.
Thanks so much, Bridget.
Bye-bye.
Bye.